To say that Spider-Man is one of the most important characters created in the last 100 years would still, in my opinion, not do justice to how much Spider-Man has affected the world, and clearly Hollywood agrees, seeing as we've had 4 different versions of Spider-Man in the movies in the last 20 years alone. However, the desire to make Spider-Man movies actually goes way back to the 1980s, when Canon Films and 2 up-and-coming screenwriters named John Brencado and Ted Newsom thought they had a Spider-Man movie in the bag. So, what if it had been made? In 1985, following the cancellation of the Spider-Man body horror movie directed by Tobe Hooper, Canon Films would go back to the drawing board. Stan Lee insisted that they needed to stick more to the source material this time. But despite this, Hooper had signed a 3-picture deal with Canon, and Canon had no intention of letting him go anywhere. But they did agree to give Stan Lee more time in order to find writers that could pen a more faithful screenplay. Around this same time, a pair of up-and-coming screenwriters named Ted Newsom and John Brencado decided to try their luck at getting into Hollywood, and the best way they thought to do it was to befriend an idol of theirs, aka Stan Lee. Ultimately, their plan seemed to work, as Lee got along really well with the pair, and would actually commission them to write a full screenplay for a movie based on Nick Fury and the Howling Commandos. Sadly, this script has never been released, but we do know that Lee really liked it, and though he was unsuccessful in pitching the movie to studios, he decided to ask the pair if they had any interest in any other Marvel characters. The pair immediately leapt up and proclaimed they wanted to write a Spider-Man script. Brencado and Newsom would then write a script for a movie tentatively titled Spider-Man: The Adventure Begins, which was written over the course of only 8 weeks, but this version was far more faithful to the comics and would have featured many beloved characters. However, one character that the pair wanted to include but ultimately didn't was the Green Goblin. You see, Stan Lee himself would actually shoot his inclusion down because he believed that Dr. Octopus would be a better first villain for a Spider-Man movie, so they tweaked the script. They also apparently intended to kill off Aunt May, but Stan Lee refused to allow them to do this, and now while never set in stone, both Tom Cruise and stuntman Scott Leva were considered for the role of Spider-Man. The story would follow a college-age Peter Parker, who is best friends with Harry Osborn, has a faraway crush on Liz Allen, and lives with his Uncle Ben and Aunt May. And we can see that Uncle Ben seems to be feeling a little bit guilty, because he feels like he hasn't been the father that Peter needs. Peter, meanwhile, also works a part-time job at the Daily Bugle, under his strict boss J. Jonah Jameson. Now one day, Peter attends a particle accelerator demonstration, hosted by his professor/mentor Otto Octavius. However, as you can probably expect, the experiment doesn't exactly go right, and the resulting explosion sets loose a radioactive spider, which bites Peter on the hand, and gives him the Spider-Man powers. Octavius, meanwhile, would get fused with the metal arms that he used for his experiment, and he becomes Doc Ock. Peter begins to experiment with his new powers, and he decides to use them in a wrestling competition against WWF superstar Hulk Hogan. He commissions his iconic Spider-Man costume from a local Halloween store, the owner of which was rumored to be played by Stan Lee himself. Now, after his match with Hogan, he's invited to appear on the David Letterman show. However, afterwards, he's so caught up in his fame that he doesn't stop a man from robbing a store, and later on, it turns out that the same man actually breaks into Peter's house in order to escape from the police, and he kills Uncle Ben. Now, on his gravestone is marked, "With great power comes great responsibility." Peter takes this advice to heart and becomes the Spider-Man that we all know and love. Now, throughout the movie, Peter and Liz would be getting closer to each other because Peter's confidence is starting to grow, and he finds the will to open up a bit more. And meanwhile, Doc Ock is attempting his same experiment a second time, but the accelerator causes a rift to open, which begins to suck everything in the city into it. Spider-Man, in the end, has to both rescue Liz and defeat Doc Ock at the same time. He succeeds at doing both, and he reveals his identity to Liz, and they begin a relationship. Peter's journey into Spider-Man is now complete. However, the entire movie's production would begin to crack when Tobe Hooper decided to exit the project due to not being a superhero fan. Joseph Zito, director of Friday the 13th, The Final Chapter, and Invasion USA, will put his name forth to replace Hooper as director. Cannon would grant him the position, with the promise that he would be contractually allowed to work on the script. Now, when he ultimately wasn't involved in the writing process as promised, Cannon decided to take it out on Brencado and Newsom, who were fired from the project entirely, and thus their vision for the character ultimately died right then and there. Okay, so I need to talk about something that I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys noticed when I was talking about this movie, and that's the really obvious similarities between this movie and the first two Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. I mean, Uncle Ben's death is basically exactly the same in both versions, it's just a little bit different in this one. Doc Ock's transformation is exactly the same, and his experiment is basically exactly the same. The third act of the movie sounds basically the same. He has a wrestling match with a famous WWE wrestler in both versions. Like in this version is Hulk Hogan, and the one we got is Macho Man Randy Savage. And it's like, wow, how many similarities can there be without it being like so weird? Because like, you know, it didn't occur to me until I started making these cancel Marvel movie videos how much ends up in the actual movie, but like people don't get credit for it. Because as far as I know, they didn't get credited for their work on this movie. You know, Newsom and Brencado, I mean. I don't think their names were mentioned on the credits for the first Spider-Man movie, and if they weren't, then I think that's kind of weird, because I think you guys can tell that Sam Raimi's Spider-Man got a lot of inspiration from this version. I mean, at least I see it that way. It's really damn similar. It's really close, honestly. Like, it's kind of scary how close it is. I mean, there are differences. Don't get me wrong. It's not an exact copy and paste by any means. I mean, Mary Jane Watson's not the love interest. It's Liz Allen. This movie doesn't really explore his struggles with being Spider-Man as much as, say, the first two Spider-Man movies did. You know, the stuff at the Daily Bugle is much more downplayed. You know, Doc Ock is not exactly the same character. I mean, his particle accelerator is basically the same as the fusion reactor, but it's not exactly the same. So there are some differences, but come on, this is so similar, guys. Like, so similar. It can't be a coincidence. Like, seriously, I think somebody should ask Sam Raimi or Sony whether or not they read this script before they made that movie, because it's really similar. And obviously, because it's really similar, in my opinion, it works, because I love the Sam Raimi movies, so of course I like this one. Do I think Doc Ock would make a better first villain than Green Goblin? Maybe, honestly, because Peter normally has like a sort of mentor-student relationship with Otto Octavius before he becomes Doc Ock. So I think he might be a really good first Spider-Man villain, you know, a personal villain for him. Because no disrespect to Green Goblin, but it's not like the two were ever close. I mean, they met at the beginning of that movie. So it's not like it's the most personal, you know, rivalry in the world, because, you know, they didn't know each other that well. And starting him off with a villain that he already knew very well before he became a villain, that actually sounds like a really good idea. And he could have been a great first Spider-Man villain. Now, would this movie have been good production-wise? That's a different story. Probably not, because Cannon Films, if you didn't know already, was notoriously cheap. I mean, they did Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. And if anyone's ever seen Superman 4, you know that that might be one of the most cheapest superhero movies ever put to screen. And I really don't think Spider-Man would have been any better, production-wise anyway. I think that Spider-Man was definitely better off waiting as long as it did, because I'm not saying an 80s Spider-Man movie is impossible, but Cannon Canon films would not have gone to the lengths necessary to make it as good as it could be. Even with Stan Lee there telling them what they should do, it's not like they would listen, I don't think. So, yeah, I'm happy this version didn't get made, but if it did get made, I think it would have still been a pretty solid effort. And I've said this multiple times, just because the budget is bad doesn't mean the movie is bad. You can have really great acting and really great, plot points and in dialogue. All that stuff can be great. And if the CGI is terrible, or in this case, the production, I don't think it matters because, as I've said before, the first Harry Potter movie has terrible CGI. But does anybody care? No, because they love that movie. And I think that would be the case with this. The production value would probably be bad, but people wouldn't care because it would be a really good Spider-Man movie still, in my opinion. So yeah, that's what I think would happen with this. And I do think if this movie had been a success, then maybe Canon could have afforded to give them a bigger budget with the sequel. So that would have been kind of cool, but probably not because Canon probably would have run the franchise into the ground. But, it still would have been interesting anyway. But ultimately, I am glad that we got the Sam Raimi ones instead, even if I think they definitely took a lot from this version that we almost got in the 80s. But anyway, let me know your opinion on that in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with all of your friends on all your various social media platforms. And speaking of social media, don't forget to follow me on Instagram, Rinzler_Productions, and I'll see all of you guys tomorrow in the next video.